So thank you to everybody that's registered to attend this session. Just to give you a bit of background on myself, I'm Danny Clark. I'm founder of Simply People, and I'm really pleased and delighted that Richard Heath from the Cast Metal Federation has agreed to collaborate on this session to be delivered by Chris Still, who is going to be talking about the management of vibration. The session itself is going to be recorded, so you will be able to access the session after today. So if you do miss something or you want to recap, then you'll be able to use the same registration details that we used for this event to access the materials again. So please do feel free to do that. After the session today, you'll receive a follow-up email with some contact details. If you have any questions that you think of after today, please do get in touch and I will do my best to answer them and get the answers for you in that regard. As it's 2 minutes past 2, I'm now going to hand over to Chris Still himself, following a brief introduction for the session. Just to give a bit of background on Chris. Chris is a noise and vibration specialist inspector for HSE. He does carry out inspections and investigations of workplaces, focusing on noise at work, hand-arm vibration, as well as whole body vibration issues. And he's worked in noise and vibration for more than 20 years, despite his youthful good looks. He's moved from product development to consultancy, to academia, and finally to regulation. So Chris, delighted that you agreed to deliver this session for everybody. And I'm sure that it will be very useful to everybody. So over to you, sir.
Oh, thanks very much, Danny. I'm guessing when you get talks from the HSE, usually what happens is that we spend a lot of time telling you what's in the guidance documents and the regulations. And sometimes I think maybe it'd be better if we did something a bit different because, well, you can go and read that whenever you want. So I thought I'd start off by telling you a little bit of a story about a company that we came across. I'm going to call them Company X. They do engineering activities and they've got a £5 billion turnover. So we're not talking about a small company here, we're talking about an international organisation with plenty of well-trained, experienced people and a lot of resources. And they decided that what they were going to do was, because they've got so many engineering shops, that they were going to put numbers on all their handheld power tools and engrave numbers on them. So they had about 5 or 6 sites. And they got together a team of guys that they were going to send out to do this work and gave them some engravers. And they went out and they got a product that had sort of this type of product here that's got, sorry, I'm just trying to move. Can you see the vibration level there at the bottom? There we go. Yeah, so they went off and got this tool here. It's got a vibration level of about 7.7. Not the lowest one that you can get on the market, but that's the one that they went with. And off they went to go and do their work. And as a result of doing this, they nearly went to court with the HSE. They came very close to actually being prosecuted for this activity. Now, this seems an odd thing to be prosecuted for. What actually happened? Why were they nearly prosecuted? Well, they were reporting halves cases off of this job. They had one worker who was off work for 4 weeks with severe hand pain as a result of trying to use that power tool. And they actually didn't manage to engrave very many of the tools. I think out of over maybe 600 or 700 tools, they only did about 20 in the period that they were hoping to get done. Spoke to one of the people and he said that they'd engraved each digit a number of times because it wouldn't mark the metal, the tool that we're using, and they had to press quite hard using both hands and had to use it on the maximum settings. So there's clearly something wrong with the power tool that they've taken. And one of the site engineers who just happened to be passing was the person who actually stopped the work. He saw what they were using, looked at how they were using it and said, you need to stop doing this because you're actually going to harm people. So what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this? I mean, there's nothing wrong with this tool specifically. What is it that the engineer noticed? Well, what the engineer noticed was that he thought it was unusual that something that's been supplied as an engineering product is also supplied with a load of plastic stencils that have got love hearts and flowers and little helicopters on them. And he thought, that's a bit strange. And he asked them, where did you get it from? And they said that they got it from Hobbycraft, that they bought this thing from Hobbycraft. And it's mainly designed for people to put, you know, nice pictures on belts and glasses. It is not designed to engrave hardened steel. Right, why am I telling you this story? Well, you need to understand your process to understand your halve risks. There needs to be understanding of what you're doing and that there is a halves risk there. They didn't really think there would be a hand-arm vibration risk because they didn't think this tool would be something to be a problem, despite it having stated what the vibration value was in it. Just buying the lowest vibration tool is not always the answer. Sometimes you can buy things which are low vibration, which aren't efficient. And the reason why this wasn't working was because regardless of how low a vibration it wasn't suitable to do the job, because it had to be kept doing multiple times. But the main thing to take away from it is it doesn't matter how big you are, you can still make mistakes. So, you know, if you make mistakes in the way that you're handling halves, don't feel too bad about it. You're probably not the only one. By the end of this talk, what I'm hoping is that you'll know what HSE inspectors get told about halves, because I'm going to tell you, when I do the training for our inspectors, I'm going to tell you what I tell them, and you'll know what HSE is looking for during a halves inspection, because these are the things that we tell our inspectors to look for. Look for these things, ask these types of questions. So the idea here being that if an HSE inspector turns up, you'll know what kind of questions they're likely to ask, and you'll be able to answer them because you've seen this. Right, so why are all the noise and vibration inspectors so miserable? Why am I such a miserable and grumpy git? And it's not because I've been stuck in my house for weeks. It's because of all the ill health riddors, so not people falling off things, but actual ill health riddors that are reported to HSE. About half of them are for halves, and that's across all the manufacturing industries. If you look at construction, it goes up to about 75% of all ill health. And if you go and speak to the railway people, you'll find that about 90% of all their ill health riddors are for halves. So it's a significant number of the ill health that's coming through that's halves related. What's HSE's message on halves? It's a pretty straightforward message. We want you to understand the level of risk and exposure, and we want you to focus on control. And if you only have time to do one thing, if you can only figure out what to do in one of these areas, we want people to spend their time focusing on control. So you're running a company, you're the health and safety manager for a company, how should your time be split if, say, you're spending 1 day a week, 1 day a month, or 1 day a year on halves? Regardless of how much time you actually spend in it, how would you split your time? Well, that's kind of how we see how your time should be split. So the bigger the box, the more time you spend on it. And the blue stuff is all about control. So we want to see you spending most of your effort on elimination, substitution, reduction, tool purchasing policies, maintenance, and job rotation. We want to see then a fair amount of your time spent on information, instruction, and training for your employees, and a bit of time and effort on your health surveillance. The risk assessment aspect of it is relatively small in comparison to everything else. And then right down in the bottom there, you see we've got there the measurement and monitoring. Yep, if you're a hand-on vibration consultant, you're probably doing a lot of measurement and monitoring. If you're working for an organisation trying to control vibration, we don't see that as being a huge aspect of your job. That's the hand-on vibration exposure triangle. You remember the fire triangle? We used to get that at school. It's a similar sort of idea. You adjust any of these things and you can reduce exposure. So if you reduce the worker or you remove the worker from the equation, you reduce the hand-on vibration. You reduce the duration, you reduce the magnitude, you reduce the exposure. Is that message control, have a reasonable understanding of your exposures, and control, focus on control, is that message getting through to duty holders, to the employers? Let's have a look. We've got a company director pleaded guilty after 12 and given a 12-week custodial sentence, which was suspended for a 12-week curfew. So this poor guy had to drive around for 12 weeks with a tag on his ankle. A managing director of a company that was taken to court over vibrational white finger. That's what the construction inquirer called it. Local authority, £100,000 fine. And if you looked at the fines for health and safety infringements, they've gone up significantly over the last few years. You go out and you speak to employees. This is an employee in the construction sector. He's been working on the roads for 25 years. And when we were talking to him, that was the first time anybody had mentioned halves to him or white finger. So he's obviously not getting information, instruction, and training, despite the fact that he's been using a road breaker for 25 years. And why am I here talking to you today? Well, Richard sent me an email saying that one of our members, he's checking the improvement notices. One of your members has been given an improvement notice for halves, and he wanted it to raise it as an issue. So is the message about control getting through to employees? What do employees know about it? Well, I mean, from my experience, they tend to have an understanding about vibration of white finger and pins and needles and loss of pain and that type of stuff. They understand that it's bad for their health. What they kind of don't know or don't see too much of is the impact of halves. Now, it's not the worst disease in the world. I'm not saying that. It's not cancer. It's not mesothelioma. But unlike all the other RID or reportable diseases, there's no medical option available for you if you've got HAVs. There's no surgery available for you. And once you've got it, stopping the use of hand-arm vibration power tools is not going to stop you having hand-arm vibration syndrome. You speak to people, 54-year-old highly specialised mechanical engineer, made to retire, in his house taking witness statements. His wife said he'd smashed every plate in the house because he can't feel them when he takes them out of the dishwasher. 43-year-old guy, I think at the time he was the same age as me, made redundant and told that he can no longer work. I remember having a phone call with him saying, after he was made redundant, saying, what am I supposed to do? You know, I've married, I've got one child on the way, another one in the house, and the house mortgage to pay. How am I supposed to earn a living? And another one, 24-year-old construction worker, told to retrain from his trade after completing his apprenticeship, 3 years after completing his apprenticeship. And actually the company who this fellow worked for were that upset by it that they significantly changed all their hand-arm vibration control policies and procedures, because the managing director realised that it's not sustainable for them to train apprentices and only get 3 years worth of work out of them when they're hoping to get maybe 20 years worth of work. Hand-arm vibration syndrome that's progressed to stage 3 and beyond can end your career. And not only will it stop you from being an engineer or a welder or a construction worker, it means you can't go and do any other job that involves the use of hand-arm vibrating tools. So you're not going to be able to go and get a job cutting grass for the council or working at the local golf course. What about the message? Is the message getting through about control to third-party consultants? Well, let's have a quick think. How likely is it that you're going to use a third-party consultant? How much do you think British industry spends on third-party consultancy on all health and safety in a typical year? Not a COVID year, but a typical year. Well, typically it's about £1.2 billion. And that's about, the HSE's budget's about £100 million. That's what we get from central government. So the chances are that you are getting your advice from a third-party consultant, because we've got to do enforcement and a range of other things. So you're unlikely to be able to get hold of an HSE inspector to give you advice on what to do. What are the consultants saying? Well, here we've got a chap who's been taken to court and fined £1,400, humiliated for incompetence is the headline. He got it wrong on hand-arm vibration exposure and workplace noise. And the reason for that was he'd been around multiple sites giving bad advice and telling multiple employers the wrong thing to do. This is a statement from an expert witness who was in court, prepared to say this in court. If anti-vibration gloves were provided and worn, then this can be expected to reduce vibration exposure by, say, 30%. And he was prepared to take the company and defend himself against an HSE prosecution because they'd issued anti-vibration gloves. Now, what is HSE's view on anti-vibration gloves? Well, if you go and have a look at one of our research reports, it says gloves cannot be relied upon to reduce the operator's exposure to vibration. Now, okay, not everybody's going to know that. It's a technical report. However, it was the document that the expert witness had related to when he said he would get a 30% reduction. That is the next sentence that comes after the 30% reduction. So we should know that it doesn't work. And his excuse for not knowing is reduced even further because it says in our guidance document that you can't rely on anti-vibration gloves as a means of protection. Essentially, there isn't any PPE for hand-arm vibration. So our key message: understand your level of risk and exposure, focus on control. Let's just stop for a second and go through the risk exposure element of it. Risk assessments for halves don't have to be massive. The document you see there is something that's used relatively widely amongst local authorities. It establishes what the task is, it tells what the tools are, it gives an indication of what the control measures that you put in place, and it's used our calculator at the bottom to say these are the exposure points. So you can say, here's 4 or 5 jobs that amounts to X number of points, how many of them can you do in the day, and you can schedule work that way. Why is HSE publishing a new vibration calculator tool? Well, we've put that up now because it's got drop-down menus. So I'm guessing most of you are aware of this. If you go and use our calculator now, it's actually got drop-down menus with vibration magnitudes in them. And that's to try and make it easier for people to understand what the risk is. You, as an employer, you know your job, you know what you're doing. What you probably don't know is what the vibration levels are. Is there a legal requirement to do measurements? Are you legally required to do vibration measurements? No, you are not. What we're looking for is a probable magnitude and, if necessary, measure. So if you have a tool that's been used in a unique way, or you can't find any data for it, get a measurement. If you can find the data on the HSE's webpage, that's the best place to start. What if the work's really varied? It's almost impossible to figure out what we do. This is a constant thing that we get told. It's so difficult for us to understand what we're up to and estimate what the trigger times are. There's no controlling factor on what or how much an employee can do. That's the question that we think you should be asking yourself, is what is the thing that you're already using as a controlling factor on your work processes? How are you charging out for time? How many things can you actually produce in a day? What types of examples have we seen? I've come across companies that are using vending machines so they can keep an eye on how many grinding discs that are being used to help them estimate what their vibration exposures are. Even came across one company that was weighing their grinding discs to see how much material they reckoned that they were removing. I've seen companies that were figuring out how much welding flux they were going through because they reckoned that if they used X meters of welding flux, that would equal X amount of grinding. I've seen other organisations where they do takeoffs from the CAD drawings, which estimate the amount of work that's needed to fettle or grind a system or a part, and the actual drawing has the vibration exposure number, the points stamped on the drawing. And I've come across companies that simply just measure up how much welding that they're doing and make estimations on grinding and exposure from that. But I still need to do measurements. Well, if you really need to do measurements, what I would say is that that's fair enough. It can still happen. You have to be aware that it's not an easy thing to get repeatable, reproducible, and reliable vibration measurements, and they need to be done in accordance with relevant standards. So if you are going to get someone in to do it, or you're going to do it yourself, be confident that what you're getting is correct. Right. Some of you might be aware that we updated the guidance document in 2019. If you're looking for a copy of it, it's on the website. It doesn't cost you anything to download it for free. What are the main things that you should know about the updates? This is exactly the same thing that I've said to the inspectors, so that they know what the updates are in the new guidance document. It's shorter. The reason why it's shorter, primarily, is because this case studies have been removed. What's in there now is a table. I've picked out the bit of the table that's probably relevant to you. And the idea here is that our inspectors, we say, right, if you're going out to a light fabrication work and you think they're going to be using hand-guided or hand-fed machineries, you should be looking for mechanised or automated processes. If they're using riveting guns, have they got an alternative for a different fabrication process? So when they go to site and they see these problems, they ask the solution questions, and they expect the manufacturer, the company, to be able to give a good reason why they're not using them, or point to where they are using them. So that's something to start off with, is can you answer those questions? And if the things that are in the solution column don't fit into your work, then what's the reason for it, so that you can answer that question to the inspector when they turn up. And if you're looking for case studies, well, Vibration Solutions, spoke to this about Richard, it's still on the website. I had a quick look through. I think there's about 51 case studies on it, and 19 of them are mentioned or are specific to cast metals. So if you've not seen that document, or you haven't looked at it in a while, it's definitely worth having a look through to say, yep, we're doing that, we're doing that. Again, it's an easy way to show to the inspector that you're following the expectations for control. Rule of thumb is now more obvious in the guidance document. What's the rule of thumb? Well, if you're using a rotating tool, if you're using a handheld grinder for an hour, that's going to be above the action value. If you're using it for 4 hours, it's likely to be above the limit value. That's a really useful bit of information. If you're sat in your office that's next to the production floor and you can hear somebody using a grinder and it seems to have gone on for more than an hour, and you're thinking, oh, do we have a HABS exposure assessment for that? Have we got any control measures in place? It helps you understand. This is what the inspectors are using as their first step to understand what is the likelihood of this person, this organisation being above the action value or the limit value. For percussive tools, for impact drills, that type of stuff, it's 15 minutes to get the action value and an hour to get to the limit value. So having that in the back of your head when you're thinking about halves is really useful. And remember, it's trigger time, it's time pulling the trigger. The new document includes a vibration data table. That's in there because it marries up with the new drop-down menus that are in the calculator. There are a few discrepancies because we're updating the calculator, and the calculator is probably the best place to go to, because when we get more information on a particular tool, or we get more information on a new tool, we can add it to the calculator. Warm clothes for those exposed to work outside is a must. That's what we're expecting now, so we will be asking that. And if you work in a cold environment, which I'd imagine most factory sites are getting a bit colder now, then we expect to see warm clothes being provided, and that can be something as simple as just gloves or long sleeve jumpers. The sections in the document will be arranged just to help the flow of it. The key thing is with the update is the legislation remains unchanged, and the advice just puts more focus on control. Right. What's your health surveillance like? You'll be asked this by the inspectors. If you think you've got a HAVS issue, they'll ask you what your health surveillance is. What have you got in place? So what do you think the percentage uptake is on health surveillance for HAVS in high risk plus workplaces? Last time we asked, how many companies that we know have got HAVS risk are bothering to use health surveillance? It was about 15%. That's what we found. That was in 2012. I spoke to a group of occupational health providers a year ago and said, have you seen a 75% increase, 80% increase in your workload since 2012? And they all answered, no, we haven't. So if you think you've got a HAVS risk and you don't have health surveillance, you're going to get yourself problems. And the key thing about health surveillance is it's there to help you. It's there as a backstop, so you understand that someone's been made ill, so you can go back through your control processes and your assessment and figure out where things went wrong. Purpose of health surveillance is to check controls are working and also to protect you from civil litigation. It's really useful to be able to show that someone started work with you, they didn't have an issue, you checked them periodically through their employment, and when they left, they didn't have an issue. Right, control, focusing on control. Process selection. What are the things that you can do for that? Well, I see a lot of cast metal places where they're using robotic fettling. So you're bound to be asked questions about that. Are you using it? Can you use it? Why can't you use it? Have reasons. What are the reasons for it? And make sure that you understand what those reasons are so that you can answer those questions to the inspector. Tool selection. Have you got a tool purchasing policy in place? Now, we're aware of the fact that there are some jobs where you just have to use things like handheld grinders and what have you. So HSE's just started a research program on low vibration grinder options. So we're looking at things like auto balancers, we're looking at backing pads and anti-vibration mounts and all these types of things to see what works best and what is useful for you. But certainly we expect you as an employer to have a tool purchasing policy and be looking out for things which are vibration efficient, i.e. you can do the job as well, if not better, than the tools you're already using, and the exposure is reduced. And consumables. Well, we know flapper discs are lower vibration than standard discs. We're also looking into alternative discs as part of that grinding project, but that's something that you'll be asked about. Can you use them? If not, what's the reason? And if your reason is we can't get the quality of finish, our inspectors will generally accept that. But certainly other things like cutting elements, are you using diamond tip blades because they find that they produce less vibration and tend to work quicker? And then maintenance. Are you doing maintenance of your tools and your equipment? And we absolutely expect to see that. That is part of the guidance as well, probably maintained as necessarily through the working life to sustain minimum vibration. And we'll be looking at things like, do you send the tool off to get it checked? Sometimes the tools that you've got are at such a pay point that there's no point in you in doing the maintenance. You don't have too much of an issue with that. It's just as long as you're replacing them on a regular basis as and when you need to. And then things like regulators, if you're using compressed air systems that help to oil the tool and reduce dampness, because that helps keep the tool in good condition. And then we get right down to the bottom of the hierarchy, because there is no PPE for HAVS. So when we get into job rotation, we're doing things like, well, are you doing that? Are you letting someone use the breaker for a few minutes and then switching over to digging a hole and then have a go at throwing a bucket about? Right. So I said to you, why are all the HSE noise and vibration inspectors so miserable? The reason why we're so miserable is because on our website, it currently says that we want to control by 2015 so that occupational disease cases of HAVS sufficiently to enable workers to remain at work without disability. Sadly, it's 2020 and we're still coming across workers who are in that situation. Now, that's not to say that if you're following the regulatory guidance that those things won't happen, but we're coming across companies who aren't following the guidance, and so we're still seeing ill health. We at HSE cannot achieve this goal, regardless of whether we set it in 2020 or 2025, or 2015, we can't achieve that goal unless we get the support we need from organisations like the Cast Metal Federation and you as members to have a look at what you're doing with halves and see what can I do to reduce the vibration exposure. Right, key message again, understand your exposure and understand your control. And just think about that. Think about how much time you're spending on it and where you focus your time. Well, that's the end of my presentation, so I'm happy to take questions now.
Thanks a lot, Chris. That was really useful. If anyone does have any questions, please do put it into the question box that's on your dashboard.
I think we've had a few come through into the chat box actually, right towards the start.
I'm seeing some here. This is a good one. How serious is highways industry taking noise and vibration? Obviously, dust is another issue. So, well, that for me, that splits into two things. There's new road building and then there's road repair. We've seen some really significant issues with the amount of RIDDORs that came through from road repair activities, whether that's reinstatement from utilities or whether that's pothole repair. Now, that's not been great, but what is encouraging is that they really have made some significant changes. A lot of the companies are pushing away from hand-used power tools and trying to get onto vehicle-mounted tools and reduce the amount of vibration exposure that they've got. But yeah, it's still a big issue, but we're definitely seeing changes there. And genuinely, with the equipment that's now available and becoming available, I genuinely think that in 10 years' time, it would be technically possible for people that are doing utilities work and pothole repair to not actually physically lay their hand on a power tool unless for very specific circumstances.
Yeah, we've had a few questions come through. How often should employers be checking their employees' exposure?
So, in the guidance document, what it says is that once you've established what your activity is, then you've got your risk assessment. Unless you change that activity significantly, you don't need to reassess. And the idea there being is that we don't want to overburden you with constantly having to reassess. But if you're changing the process, if you've introduced a new tooling process or a new practice, then you maybe want to reassess it. And if you've changed to a lower vibration tool, you might want to reassess your risk assessment. But it's not something that we'd say you have to do it on a periodic basis. It's really if you feel that you've changed to a significant extent. So if you're doing a very similar thing all the time, I would question why you would want to constantly be reassessing it.
I had another one. I have several companies which cut steel with machinery and the operative holds the sheet. Is there a way to measure this?
Yeah, we get questions about vibration on the part quite a lot. Now, we don't have any data on our website. We're actually very much held within HSE to see what these things are. It is possible to measure vibration on the part by doing vibration measurements, but it's very dependent on where you place it. The one thing that we have found is that the vibration exposure levels are lower when you're holding the part than when you're holding the tool. So if you have a look at the vibration solutions book, you'll see a few things in there where people are doing things like using lineages, and instead of using a handheld lineage, they've got a desk mounted or table mounted lineage and working the piece on that. So it's certainly a lower vibration method, but it's something we don't have a lot of information on, I'm afraid.
Okay. Next one, how do you determine who is a regular user of vibrating tools?
So, yeah, we spoke there about the rule of thumb that, okay, they're using a rotating tool for about an hour, and that gives you an indication of whether the action value, the exposure value comes in for a typical task or activity. The next thing after that is, well, okay, what do you do it 1 day a week or 2 days a week? The term we use is regular and frequent, and you'll get a bit of variance on what we mean by regular and frequent. But as a general rule of thumb, we would probably say 2 or 3 days per week. So if we're doing something 2 or 3 days a week, now that can be difficult to understand. But a good example would be people that work in, say, groundwork or greenskeeping. So they might not be cutting the grass all year round. So they might have a few months where they never use a lawnmower or a strimmer, but certainly on the periods when they are using it, they're using it 2 or 3 days a week, maybe every day of the week. So you might have an issue with what you're doing over the course of a year. You might have an issue with what you're doing over the course of a week. But yeah, regular and frequent is what we're looking at.
A question that's come in, well, can you clarify how it might be possible for people to add specific measurements into the new calculator?
You can, when you open up the calculator, you can put in your own data if you want. So if you've got vibration data from a manufacturer, so the thing that I would say, what I say to manufacturers is, can you tell me what the vibration exposure is from this tool, piece of equipment, when it's doing the task that we're going to do? A lot of them won't have that. If you look at some manufacturers, are quite good. So some of the manufacturers will say things like, if you're drilling out concrete with this tool, then it should get this exposure value. But if you're drilling holes in steel, it gets this. And if you want to put those numbers in, you can. We are, over the course of time, going to update the information that's in there. So the tool lists we've got aren't exhaustive. And some tools, we've got measurement data on some tools which aren't in the calculator because we just don't have a big enough data set to say this is what we think it gets on average. But we do intend to add to it.
Okay. What additional controls can be used for companies supplying labour to construction and rail industries, as the operatives are often controlled by a principal contractor?
This is one of the things that I personally find frustrating, because I speak to subcontractors who miss out on work, and they'll say things like, well, we figured out how many people we needed to send to site, and we lost the job to somebody else because they sent less people. You know, there should be an expectation that before you get to site, you have a reasonable understanding of what the risk is. So I think you should be highlighting that to the main contractors and saying, you know, what are you doing about it? The question that was asked was, what can you do to push back? Is that right? They're saying, what can we do to push back on the main contractor?
It just says what additional controls can be used for companies supplying labour to construction and rail, because they're often, the operatives are often controlled by a principal contractor. So whether this is more about the sort of chain of command and who's taking responsibility for making sure people are working safely on the site each day, I don't know. The questioner hasn't added on that one.
I mean, I think if you're doing subcontracting work, there should be an expectation by you to understand what your risk is. I think what I've seen with construction is that they basically turn around and put all the effort and issue onto the subcontractor. So I'll give you an example of a company I came across. So they were a steel fixing organisation, and they were given a task to do, and they looked at the way that it had been designed, and they said, this is really high vibration exposure for us. You know, why are you telling us to do this? Because there's a different way of doing it. And they pushed back on the main contractor and actually pushed back on the designer about that. And I would encourage anybody to do that, is to push back stuff up through CDM regulations to say, look, you're supposed to try and design these things so that they don't cause risks. So if you've decided that you're going to, you know, require us to use this particular construction method that results in large numbers of vibration exposure, then you have to understand what the risk is from that, and understand that there's a premium cost for it, because you might have to send more people to site in order to reduce exposure, or you might have to take longer to do it. And yeah, that I would try to push back on that if possible. I know it's not easy, but certainly. And you know, the reason why I found out about that was because the subcontractor raised it with HSE as a concern. And you know, be aware that you can do that. You can, as a subcontractor. You know, I did a job in Bristol where the subcontractor raised concerns about the way that the main contractor had designed the removal of a concrete floor. So we spoke to them about it. Why are you doing it this way?
Okay, here's an interesting one. How does the HSE approach manual hammering and vibration exposures?
So yeah, I know I know there's a kind of perception if you're using a hammer that you'll get vibration exposure from it. We tend to find that tends to lean more towards the side of an MST issue. The hammer stuff, the vibration that we are looking at is much more higher frequency. And it's something that comes into play as well when you're looking at people that are using impulsive tools like nail guns and stuff like that. That there's a bit of a question mark as to whether the vibration that exposes you to is actually the sort of thing that leads to hand-arm vibration syndrome. So we don't really include things like using hammers or hitting things with mallets as part of halves, but we do see them being things that would result in repetitive strain injuries and that type of thing.
And now we've got a number of questions around the same thing for this next one. But I'll go with this particular one. Following a recent health surveillance referral, which hasn't identified halves, the doctor involved suggested the use of a monitoring device worn on the wrist. I don't personally agree with this, and what thoughts do the panelists have? And there are a large number of people who are asking the same question about the effectiveness and accuracy of these wrist-worn devices that are being promoted quite heavily on the market.
Right. So first protocol for you is, if you have a look on our website, we've got a frequently asked questions about monitoring, measurement, and timing devices. Right. Now, we're not completely against them. We don't advocate the use of them, but we certainly understand that some people feel that they can be beneficial, and in some instances, if people want to use them, that's up to them. My experience is that sometimes it can be quite expensive, and I've said there that our key message is control, and if you had, it's not unreasonable for some companies to be spending £100,000 on these things for giving it to multiple employees. If I would rather you had £100,000 going a begging to spend on vibration control, that you were spending it on, a new piece of machinery that also that reduces vibration, but also improves your efficiency. So coming back to the wrist-mounted devices and any of the devices, first thing to understand is that they're not measuring vibration in the manner that's required by the standard for measurement of vibration, but that's not to say that they can't be used for monitoring vibration. So that's a reasonable thing to do. So don't confuse them with vibration measurement. None of them claim that they can do that. They all claim that they're there as a monitoring device. The doctor asking you to do it. Now, if it was broad brush approach and they were saying, give these to everybody, you would question what you're up to there. I understand why the doctor would say that, because what they're probably saying, if it is somebody that's got halves, is this person needs to have a controlled exposure to vibration. And where we've seen doctors advising the use of them is where someone's been told they have to keep it below 50 points, but they still want to carry on working. So they want to avoid the getting made redundant aspect of it, but they still don't want to be exposed to too much. So I've seen people being advised to wear wrist-mounted devices or any monitoring device, doesn't have to be on the wrist, could be anywhere, been using that because it's been advised by the doctor. But in this instance, it says they haven't identified halves. So my question there, twofold. One, the doctor is supposed to know roughly what the vibration exposure is for the employee when they turn up for the medical examination, because how else is he going to help? How else is he going to do a diagnosis? Halves is an exclusory diagnosis. So what they do is they say, yes, you've got the symptoms, let's rule out all the other things that could potentially cause it. Do you have primary renal disease, that type of stuff. So the doctor really should have an understanding of what the typical vibration exposure is. If he's asking for you to wear a watch when he doesn't have a halves diagnosis, essentially what he's saying is he doesn't know what level of vibration that person's been exposed to. And really it's your job as an employer to do that. Now I've seen a lot of people being diagnosed with halves on the basis that the employee was left to tell the doctor what their exposure levels were. And if you have someone who cuts grass all day, they'll tell the doctor that they cut grass for 8 hours a day, when in reality they're actually pushing a lawnmower for maybe 4 hours a day. And that's a big difference in terms of their vibration exposure. So yeah, one, I think there's a question there about whether the doctor actually knows what the vibration exposure is. And two, if he's asking for it to be worn so he gets an understanding of it, it's probably because he's not sure whether he can actually give them a halves diagnosis. So that to me suggests that that person probably needs to go and be able to tell the doctor, this is what we think this employee is exposed to.
Okay. One, not directly on vibration, but obviously as you're a noise and vibration specialist, I just thought we'd throw this one in the mix. With regards to noise, the type of protection is very varied, as there are so many different types of hearing protection. Does the HSE have any preference on the type of hearing protection?
No, we don't. Our main preference is that you're wearing it. The big issue we've got is that people don't seem to be, they're taking it out, they're removing it, not wearing it correctly. There's an expectation in the guidance that you would offer people a range of hearing protection so that they have stuff that's good for them. So the typical sort of yellow earplugs that you get, the sort of baseline ones that you can buy, I can get one of them in that ear, but I can't get it in that ear because my ear canal is too small in that ear. But it's not a thing about how big you are, because I used to work with a woman, Liz, who was 4'11", and her ear canals were so big that if you put earplugs in, they had to remove them with tweezers because they just fell right inside her lugs. So, we don't have a preference for whatever hearing protection we've got. Our preference is that it works. So if you find stuff that works for you, or you find stuff that works for one employee but doesn't work for another, we'd expect you to provide stuff for that. One thing that we have noticed is that things that tend to encourage people to wear them and not take them off tends to be quite a good thing. So we've seen that communication headsets have been quite effective because people are less likely to take them off because they can now speak to one another without having to remove them. And we've also seen some headsets cautiously using them because you can play music and stuff through them, which can potentially cause an issue with safety, but it also, if the music level is set too high, it can produce its own noise risk. But certainly those types of things, people are loath to take them off because they like listening to radio too while they're doing their job. But we don't have a preference over any hearing protection.
Okay, we've got a few questions now around the health surveillance. Starting off with, can employers deliver the preliminary questionnaire and then refer onwards if there's a concern? I recall the advice being that it's medically confidential, so should be done by a medical professional.
Right. So the tiered system, the first aspect of it is the sort of introductory health check, right? So this is you've just started working, and that should be undertaken by somebody who's medically trained, right? You then have the tier 2, which is what you would call what happens on a regular basis type stuff. That you can do that yourself. The person who does it should have some sort of training to do it. And really the questions that are being asked, they shouldn't be medical in confidence type stuff. And certainly the information that you get back from a health surveillance provider that's issued to you as an employer, hopefully shouldn't include medical in confidence information. It should be a straight indication of what's going wrong. Effectively what you're doing when you do it yourself is you're trying to filter the people that you think need to go for the health surveillance. So yes, you can do it yourself, but there's an expectation that you would get some training done.
Okay. Where are we? Lots of them coming into the questions from me around. What's the minimum exposure level that means an employee does not need health surveillance?
The minimum. So if they don't have any underlying health issues, then if they're below 2.5 meters per second on A8 over their typical day, then you wouldn't need to provide health surveillance. If, however, you've got somebody who's got an underlying condition, so say you're employing somebody who's had a previous injury to their hand, or they've got primary Raynaud's, so some people, their fingers naturally blanch when it's cold, then you might want to put that person under health surveillance. So that's the way that the regulations are set up. So 2.5 meters a second. That the action value, the thing that says you've got a halves risk here, is the thing that says that you should be doing health surveillance. If you've got someone who's already got halves and they're using power tools, even if you're below the 2.5, we would recommend that you can carry on with the health surveillance, because we know that people can get hand-arm vibrations syndrome at levels below 2.5.
Which is interesting, because that leads into the next question here. If a person at the initial questionnaire stage is likely to have halves and they are to be employed to use power tools, would a company be discriminating against them if they said they were unable to hire them?
So you can't ask people, now you're getting into the health surveillance stuff, and I'm not the health surveillance board here, but my understanding is that you can't ask people before they start working whether or not they've got an ill health issue. So what you do is not a pre-employment health check, you do a at-employment health check. If you then find out that that individual's got underlying health issues that stop them from being able to work, then you've probably got some issues there as to how you're going to deal with that. But yeah, sorry, what was the question again? I kind of went off on a tangent there, didn't I?
It was
I think part of that, Richard, sorry, just to interject, would probably be covered by an employment lawyer as opposed to Chris.
Yeah, the thing I do know is that you can't do it before the employment. But yeah, I think if you thanks for that.
No, sorry, I'm just conscious that I could just imagine that Chris said.
Yeah, well, that happens a lot.
Yeah.
If an issue is reported, what would be the viewpoint of the HSE when there was a safer alternative available and an employer chose not to equip their workers with the relevant safer tooling, which would have prevented the issue from occurring?
So that's the process that we go through when we ask about the control stuff. So like just now I'm in the process of writing an expert witness report, and it's a situation where, you know, the question is, were they exposed above the action value? I'm looking at that. If you come down on the process of yes, they were, the next thing you look at is, well, what are other things that they could have done? So we then go through those control measures that I spoke about briefly, the stuff that's in the vibration solutions, the stuff that's in the guidance document. Now, if it's stuff that's in the guidance document, there's, you know, it's as low as reasonably practicable. So there are very few things that we specifically say you must do. So everything that's in our guidance is guidance in and of itself. So if we see people that are using a particular process and there's another process that they could have been using which is lower vibration, they have to have a very good reason for not doing it or not using that. Now, it may be the case that they do have a very good reason for it because of the what they're doing. But if we can show that, well, this process should have been applied, you didn't apply it, and you don't really have a very good reason for not applying it, then we can issue that as saying, well, that's them they've not reached as low as reasonably practical. But it's not a hard and fast rule. We don't have very many things that we would specifically say. I mean, the only one that I can think of specifically for halves is if we went to a construction site and we saw somebody doing pile cropping with a breaker and they weren't using a pile cropping machine, then we would take a pretty dim view on that. But even that, we still allow for the occasional use of a handheld breaker to get into bits that are difficult to get to.
Okay, and here's an interesting one. What's your thoughts on how we might be able to increase the take-up and interest in health surveillance by companies where HAVS applies?
Well, I mean, HSE, we say to people, you have to have the health surveillance because that's the thing that tells you if your controls are working. It's the backstop. It's the thing that lets you know you've done your risk assessment, we've put our controls in place, and oh, by the way, we've found out we've got someone who's got ill here, something's not right, we need to go back and look at it again. But for me, the key thing is that, you know, if you're going to end up in a civil case, if you're going to end up, you know, paying out for making people ill, that is what they will use as something to hit you over the head with as an employer. They will say, look, I've been made ill here, and, you know, generally either the health surveillance says that I was ill when I worked there, or more likely there just isn't any health surveillance, so you can't prove that the person wasn't ill when they did work with you. So I think those two things are the things that make the difference. When I do the noise talk, I usually show a slide which shows the employer's liability claims for ill health, and HAVS is certainly within the top 10, and noise is obviously the #1 issue. But it's just that thing about, you know, it's beneficial for your employees to have health surveillance, and it's beneficial for you as an employer to have health surveillance.
Okay. We've had, let me just call the Q&A back up again. Is using manufacturer's data sufficient, or is there an expectation to use real data, such as measurements taken with the tool in use on materials? as opposed to measurements from the free run state?
So you've got the calculator that's online, and it's got initial vibration levels for you, which we put in the calculator. If you have a look in the guidance document, you'll see that there's a table with tools and a range. And that range is what we typically expect to see from a tool. Now, when you go and have a look at manufacturers' data, so let's say you're looking at, we'll call it for argument's sake a widget, right? You're looking at buy a widget, and you have a look at the HSE's data table in the guidance document, and it says, on average, it gives you 9, but it's somewhere between 6 and 12. And you have a look at the widget manufacturer, and they're saying that it produces 2 meters a second. So it's way below what the HSE say. That should ring a bell in your head to say to the manufacturer, well, you're significantly lower in terms of vibration than what the HSE say all the other tools that are that type of tool produce. Why are you low? A lot of the ISO standard tests that are available, they don't test the tool in use. They test it in a very controlled manner. And that's done for a good reason. It's done so that they can get reproducibility and repeatability in the test, so that you can compare one tool against another, but it may not necessarily tell you what the tool does in real life. So you can, if you go to the manufacturers and you're asking for data, under the machinery directive and the regulations, machinery regulations, there's an expectation that should tell you about residual risk. And that means, okay, we know there's going to be vibration exposure from it. What is it when the tool's in use? Now, some tools are used for so many various different things. It's difficult for the manufacturer to tell you what that is, but for others, you know, handheld grinder, it's probably going to be grinding steel, it's probably going to be sanding steel, those types of things. They should be able to tell you that. And if they don't, ask them why not. And you know, I could spend, me and every other noise and vibration inspector the HSE's got, all the other 4, we could spend all day, every day, just going around the websites asking manufacturers to update their vibration information. But we've got other things to do. So that is a question that you can ask and say, look, HSE say it's within this range, why are you better? And that's not to say that there aren't tools out there that are better. There are, we know that there are. And we've been trying to sort of arrange a thing where we can get a sort of, you know, low vibration tool mark that we can put on things. Hopefully when we get the vibration research done on grinders, that will add to that information as well.
Again, I'm pretty sure I already know the answer to this one myself anyway, but what will happen when the equipment we use is getting old? Does the vibration level still remain the same throughout the life of the tool? So myself, I probably liken this to any piece of machinery, be it a car. If you don't look after it and service it and maintain it, it's going to rattle and shake and fall apart. I presume you'd agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, remember that rule of thumb, 1 hour for a rotating tool, action value, 4 hours limit value. Those times are based on tools that are in good operational order, new, well-working tools. The story that I told you at the start about the engraving tool, that the vibration levels on that shot up massively because it's just started to, you know, fall to bits effectively. But yeah, as things get older, they tend not to work as well. So it's worth, you know, that's why we expect to see maintenance activities. If you can keep it maintained and keep it running the way that it should run, then it's, you know, you can get some tools that can last a lifetime without there being an issue. Other tools, it's not the case. And some tools, you just can't do maintenance on them. You know, your bog standard grinder. I wouldn't expect people to be doing maintenance on a bog standard grinder. If they've paid 40 or 50 pounds for it, I'd be expecting that when it's getting past its, you know, best before date or sell by date or whatever, that they get rid of it and get a new one.
An interesting one here. I have a case where an employee used handheld tools for 2 afternoons. He's below the A8 and doesn't have any underlying medical conditions, although his GP and I think he has carpal tunnel syndrome. Is this reportable? My take is it's best to report it to the HSE and then they'll advise if the report is not needed. Carpal tunnel syndrome is an interesting one in terms of whether people should report it or not, because it's never 100% clear, no matter how many pages or areas of the HSE website you look at, and then third party on the web, it's sort of pays your money, takes your choice kind of scenario.
You're right. There's you know, we've got clear links for halves and hand-arm vibration, for hand-arm vibration syndrome and time of use and things like that. For carpal tunnel syndrome, it's not quite clear cut. And, you know, people can get carpal tunnel syndrome without using power tools. It can be something that people can naturally get. If you think it's RIDDOR reportable, if you reported that to us, what I would expect would happen is that you would probably get a phone call just to check what's going on. And certainly if you put that information in the RIDDOR report, you know, they're not above the action value, they're barely using the power tools, etc., then it would get triaged and you may not actually get anybody coming out to visit you. You've seen there that almost half of all our RIDDOR reports are for halves. So we do have quite a, you know, stringent triage process so that we aren't sending our inspectors out to every single potential issue. And we do get people who report when they probably shouldn't. And if we think they shouldn't have reported, then we'll probably tell them, or they might not get anything back. But I mean, I would be, you know, he's using power tools. He's got potentially got a disease that's an issue there. So I think I would be inclined to report and see what the HSE come back with, but caveat it with the information to say this is what the situation is.
And another one on vibration, slightly off the main tangent, but worth asking as the final question, because we're coming towards the end of the lifetime we have available. What's the HSE's approach to total body vibration and controls that are being advised?
So yeah, whole body vibration. If noise and vibration is a poor relation of HSE, whole body vibration is the poor relation of the noise and vibration team. For whole body vibration, it's really primarily to do with driving vehicles on unmade and rough roads. That's primarily where we see the issues. And the way that you control it is slow down. And if it's a particular type of vehicle that can have an isolated seat, then you would put that sort of thing in. And also your risk factors go up if you're doing a lot of off-road driving or unmade road driving, and you're also doing a lot of manual handling type stuff as well. So if you're getting out the vehicle to lift things and move things. Now, we have got a thing called the BIRD tool, which is currently going through our MSD, musculoskeletal team's publication process, and it's hopefully coming out, I'm going to say soon, because I've done that before and been really upset how long it's taken us. And I'm sure Richard could tell you some stories as well. But
oh, yeah.
There's hopefully going to be an app that will allow you to do a rough and ready quick risk assessment for whole body vibration, and it will also give you a list of control measures as well. And as soon as that comes out, we'll be telling everybody about it. But it's been floating around for an embarrassingly long length of time. But, yeah.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much for answering all of those, Chris. As I say, we're coming towards the end of our time, so I'll hand back over to Danny.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Chris. That was really informative, and I think we've learned quite a lot from that session, to be fair. So thank you again for giving up your time today. Really, really appreciate that. I do just have a quick question in regards to feedback on the session. I'm sure Chris will appreciate a response on, did you enjoy the session? So if you can just answer that one question. Thank you for your time. Thanks for attending, and expect an email in the next day or so, just with further information regards to accessing the recording, etc. Thanks for attending.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, Chris. It's greatly appreciated. It's great to hear a presentation put that way, where the focus isn't purely on the law, but the practicality of it. I think that's a great help for everybody in industry.
Oh, thanks for your time. It's good to get a chance to speak to your members as well. Thank you.
No, brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone.